Again, leaders are the entrepreneurs. Feeders are everyone else. Their university, their government, their nonprofits that support entrepreneurship, their big companies, their investors like venture capitalists and angel investors, their service providers like the lawyers and the accountants. Now, these feeders are very important, but they play a different role than the entrepreneurs. Individual members of the organizations that are the feeders can play a leadership role. But in the absence of a critical mass of entrepreneurs being leaders in the startup community, your startup community won't sustain itself over a period of time. Now, you don't need lots and lots of leaders. In Boulder, which is 100,000 people, when I look back 15 years when I moved here, 17 years when I moved here, there are probably a dozen people that are still active today in the startup community that played leadership roles 17 years ago. Today, there's probably 100 people playing leadership roles in the startup community. But your critical mass could be a half a dozen, 10 people, 15 people. Now, principle number 2 is that these leaders have to commit to go on a long-term journey. Creating a startup takes a long time. The idea that you create a successful startup in a year or 2 years or 3 years is a fantasy. It happens every now and then. But generally speaking, it takes 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, sometimes 20 years to build a successful company. The same is true for a startup community. You have to be willing as a leader to go on a long-term journey. Now, I've lived in Boulder for 17 years, and when I talk about it, I don't talk about going on a 20-year journey in Boulder where I'm 17 years into a 20-year journey. I think about it as I'm 17 years into a 37-year journey. So at any point in time, you have to be looking out into the future, and you have to be committed as a leader to continue to work on your startup community over a long period of time. Principle number 3 is that you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage at any level in your startup community. It doesn't matter their experience level, first-time entrepreneur, aspiring entrepreneur, experienced entrepreneur. It doesn't matter whether they've been successful or they've had one failure or multiple failures or some failures and some successes. Anyone who wants to engage in the startup community, you want to make it easy for them to engage. They don't have to be from your community. They can be from another city, from another country, any ethnicity, any gender, any experience level. So if you can build this notion of inclusiveness of anyone who wants to engage, you create this very powerful engine around the startup community over this long period of time. I have a phrase I like to use that we use in Boulder all the time to describe the notion of how you engage inclusively. And the phrase is this notion of give before you get. Now, some of you may have heard the phrase pay it forward. The idea of pay it forward is somebody once did something for you, you had a mentor, or you had somebody who was older who did something for you to help you along in your development or your career. By paying it forward, you do something to help somebody else. Now, that's a cousin to the notion of give before you get. Pay it forward's cool, but it's not as powerful. Give before you get is essentially that you're willing to put energy into a relationship without knowing what you're going to get back from it. You're willing to enter into the startup community and put energy into the startup community without having a predefined transactional relationship. It's not altruism. You expect to get something back from it, but you don't know from whom or when, over what time frame, and in what currency. And in this context of inclusiveness, if you can get everybody putting energy into the startup community, everybody giving before they get, all of a sudden you get this huge amount of energy that goes into the startup community, which generates a lot of activity, which starts to, over a long period of time, generate some returns, which allows the startup community to build on itself. The last part of this notion of inclusiveness is to realize that you're not playing a zero-sum game. The zero-sum game is a game where there's a winner and there's a loser, right? Sports is the classic, right? Every now and then there's a tie, but ultimately in sports, somebody wins and somebody loses. But in the startup community, you're not playing a zero-sum game. You all in the startup community can make progress by working together and helping each other. And this notion of putting energy into the system of giving before you get, in the context of this expanding startup community, is very powerful. The last concept, or the last principle, is that you have to have activities and events that engage the entire entrepreneurial stack on a continual basis. And when I say the entire entrepreneurial stack, I mean people who want to become entrepreneurs or are interested in entrepreneurship. It also means people that are interested in entrepreneurship, people who have a lot of experience with entrepreneurship, investors, all the people around the startup community. You want to engage them in activities and events like what you're doing at NASSCOM. You want these activities and events to happen on a continual basis. So it's not that you have a ration of them. You want to have what I like to call supersaturation. You want to have so many activities and events going on that there's always stuff to do. And the trick as an entrepreneur or somebody in the startup community is not to try to do all of them, but to engage very, very deeply in the ones you do. So these are the 4 principles of building a startup community anywhere you want. The leaders have to be entrepreneurs. You have to take a long-term view, inclusive of anyone who wants to engage. And you have to have activities and events that engage the entire entrepreneurial stack on a continual basis. And why don't we do some questions in the last couple of minutes that we have?
Awesome, Brad. Thanks so much. We've got a couple of questions that came both via Twitter, and also a few of the folks had questions in themselves. I'll just summarize one question first, and then we'll get to the next one. The first question was around, so we've got an ecosystem going, and we've got a lot of participants that are very, very engaged and are getting involved. But they're not sure how do we take this to the next level, let alone measure what the next level means. How do you define different levels of the ecosystem? How can we say an ecosystem is a level 1, level 2, or level 3, and what makes it go from a level 1 to a level 2?
Don't worry about it.
I like that.
Measuring it quantitatively like that, which is a natural instinct. It's a natural instinct of all of us because so many things get measured, right? You know, the adage, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. We think about economics and government, and we're constantly looking at GDP growth and things like that. Recognize that those metrics, number one, many of them are contrived, and so they're not actually representations of what's going on. And the other is that they're often lagging indicators. So because you're not playing a zero-sum game, the startup community is such a small percentage of the overall economy that you have this amazing amount of market share to gain, even if the entire economy is stagnant. In addition, it's very lumpy, right? I love to tell stories of companies that are overnight successes that took 15 years. Like you've never heard of the company, and 15 years later, it becomes this huge overnight success. But the entrepreneurs were working at it incredibly hard for 15 years. Startup communities work the same way. And if you measure them quarterly or annually, if you try to categorize it, if you say, look how we are compared to this one, there's all kinds of statistics, and lots of people love to do that. And I'm sure, you know, on TechCrunch or any other blog, every 3 months, somebody else writes an article that has a nice headline that talks about how startup communities link and relate to each other. Don't worry about it. Focus on building your startup community, focus on building your company, play a long-term game.
Awesome. One last question for you. The question was, we have a lot of large companies now in India, from the Ciscos of the world to the eBays and the PayPal and everybody else, some of whom are speaking today. How do we get them more engaged with the startup community, knowing that this is a long-term game? And what can they be told, or what can we share with them as to why they should invest in this in the long term?
It's actually a very complicated thing that many regions struggle with and many companies struggle with. So start from the perspective that whoever asked that question is asking a question that's at the essence of one of the most challenging things to do well. my personal experience is the best way is to recognize that those companies are acting in their own self-interest when they engage with the startup community. So you want to work on ways to integrate them into the startup community in a way that helps their business, building companies and technologies around their ecosystem, using their products, bringing them in the context of other companies that are helping them grow their business, rather than the opposite, where the startup community is saying, give me, give me, give me, right? Start from the position of how can the startup community help that company actually build their business. The other is focus on individual people, not the company. So there are people within eBay who, eBay itself can't be a leader of the Bangalore startup community. It's a feeder. But there are people that work for eBay in Bangalore who can play leadership roles. Find those people, embrace those people, have them play leadership roles, be inclusive. And the more enlightened companies, and eBay probably fits in this category, will recognize that having those people involved in the startup community satisfies a need of those people. And it probably makes them better employees of eBay versus at risk for leaving. So the two points there are, don't think about what those companies can do for the startup community. Approach it from the standpoint of how can the startup community help those companies, which will cause them to invest a lot more into the startup community. When they have a reason that's tangible to their own self-interest, they'll engage. And the second is focus on individuals and getting individuals involved.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brad. I've got Ravi here with me as well. We've got a whole bunch of people who enjoyed listening to you for the last 10, 15 minutes or so. Ravi, do we have some parting thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I'm looking forward to hosting you here live next time, Brad. I think it'll be a good experience for you as well. And hopefully we'll be able to get you over here at some point. Thank you. Thanks for spending time with us.
Thanks for having me.
Nice Hawaiian shirt, by the way.
Thanks.